The best way to actually get someone to believe something you're saying is for your friend to tell you something, right? And so like the question is, how do we influence your friends? It's really gotta be, I think, a mix of different kinds of advertising and content and headlines, but also things that people can interact with where they can feel like they did their own research.
That's my friend and longtime creative collaborator, Christina Sheffey. Christina is the executive creative director at Bully Pulpit International, an award-winning and fast-growing public affairs and advertising agency. In this episode, Christina explains how narrative breadcrumbs guide the public perception of a brand or a campaign, the career milestones that led her to the position of creative leadership she's in today, and much more. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to start with your background. Where did you get your start professionally? What inspired you in getting into this business? Tell us about your origin story.
My origin story. Thanks for having me, first of all. Where did I get my professional start? I think it's hard to talk about where I got my professional start without talking about what I was interested in as a kid. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in central Pennsylvania. I didn't even know advertising really was a real career. Like you would see ads in the newspaper or like things you could clip out. I didn't even grow up with really cable TV, so it's not like I was inundated with TV ads. And I ended up knowing that I just wanted to go to college somewhere south, like farther south, because I was sick of winter. And in a city. Those were like my two big criteria. And I was a soccer player and I wanted to go somewhere I could play soccer. So I ended up at GW in DC. And I think going to GW was such an education in and of itself in the world, in other kinds of people, especially coming from central Pennsylvania where I had gone, you know, from a pretty insular community, public school system, to a place like not only DC where it's so international, but GW where there is such a focus on politics and international affairs. And everyone you're friends with there is interested in those things too. And so it sort of becomes part of what you are interested in just by virtue of, you know, the community there. And so I was lucky enough to get into the political communications program, which was, you know, I frankly don't even know if they still have it. You probably, do you know?
Well, they have SMPA.
Yeah, so it was part of the SMPA school. They only at the time admitted 30 students per year, so it felt like a huge deal just to get in. And it was basically a primer in political advertising. It's for people who want to go into political advertising. And I really fell into it because there was so much writing and reading were the things I loved most growing up. And so I really threw myself into the program. I got a ton of internships. And the other great thing about GW is I think the emphasis on getting professional experience while you're in school. You know, they make it so easy for you to arrange your schedule in a way where you're taking classes 2 or 3 days a week with the expectation that you're at an internship, you know, the rest of the time. Great to see you continuing that tradition, by the way.
Absolutely.
It's really cool. And so I ended up not only interning on Capitol Hill, but at the McGinn Group over in Arlington, run by Dan McGinn, and Peter Fenn was over there. And they're two guys that, you know, Dan McGinn had started this agency that was really, really successful. They had a few of the car accounts. They were doing some political work. I think they were working for Coke. Like, they were just a really well-established DC agency. And, you know, they basically brought me on to be like the tape intern. It was like back in the time before like you could really do clips. And so I was like literally watching like the nightly news every night to see like where their clients mentioned. But just seeing how that all came together from what was being talked about in the news to how it impacted, you know, a client's reputation to everything that I had done in school, I really decided that I really wanted to be in advertising. And at SMPA, I was lucky enough to take one video editing course my senior year of high school. And I was, senior year of college. And I was like, video editing is magic. Like, you're really creating something out of not nothing, but like the power that you have as a video editor to craft a story in a really, to make it what you want. And then the power of video editors, frankly, to make something that could be garbage into something amazing is, you know, I think directors, producers, writers get all the credit, and I think it is the video editors are due for some shine. And so, yeah, I started my career as a video editor. I actually was at Burson Marsteller for a while under Mark Penn and Jay Levitin. And we were just doing a lot of PR type things. And it was during the 2008 election, and Mark Penn was a senior advisor to the Hillary Clinton campaign. And I was so far removed. I was like, very, very entry level. But I got really bit by the bug seeing like the hustle and bustle of people who were so close to the campaign and frankly, decision making at the highest levels. And so in 2010, I had the opportunity through working with Joe Trippi and Associates to move to California to be embedded with the Jerry Brown for Governor campaign. And so I worked more than I've ever worked before or since in my life. It's pretty intense for people who've worked on a political campaign. I think I ended up cutting, I would have to go back and look, but I myself cut like over 500 ads that year. And it was just me. Like there was no assistant editor. I was the assistant editor. I was the final editor. I was like online editor, everything. It was an education in and of itself. But I was embedded in the Brown campaign offices. And so, Jerry and his wife Ann were there and, were coming in all day. And it was a small team. And I remember, like, it's still one of the most, crowning achievements of my career. Our opponent at the time was Meg Whitman, the former CEO of HP, and she was a billionaire and spending like millions, and was like one of the first billionaires to enter a political race and just spend millions and millions and millions of dollars of their own money. But she had hired the same campaign director as Arnold Schwarzenegger, the outgoing governor, who was extremely unpopular at the time. And so I watched hours, this is where the McGinn Group comes back, I watched hours and hours and hours of tape of Arnold Schwarzenegger's speeches and Meg Whitman's speeches and found about 6 minutes of bites of them saying the exact same verbatim words, but even more weird than that, like using the exact same intonation and cadence and like phrasing, like it was so strange. So I cut an ad together. There was a minute of them basically just repeating each other's lines, and the race swung 10 points within a week. And it was like one of the biggest, like still to this day, I was 25 years old. I was like, oh my God, I don't think I'm ever gonna top this. It was pretty cool.
That's amazing. Yeah. What a creative little...
Yeah, it was awesome. It was awesome. And, to be fair, it wasn't my strategy. I think like there was, strategists on the campaign that had said something like, I bet they've said the same thing. But it was, sort of my grit and like went out there and found it all and made it happen and then, cut the whole thing. It was pretty cool.
That's perfect. That's such a great example of taking advantage of a clear vulnerability, but in a like way that isn't like being nasty or digging. You're just exposing something that is true.
Well, and like using someone's inability to really, I think, see the full picture against them a little bit. Like, yes, hiring Arnold Schwarzenegger as campaign manager is maybe the right thing to do because he was successful in an unexpected way. But then what is the flip side of that? The vulnerability in tying yourself to, the same strategy,
Right. Particularly knowing that someone like Arnold was definitely just following the script.
Yeah, as well as he could.
I just want to go back to, you said 500 ads in a year? Yeah,
so I started in January, and I went from January to January of 2010 to 2011. And Jerry was not Joe's only client that year. Sorry, I guess I should call him. Governor Brown was not Joe's only client that year. He had quite a few other campaigns, and so I cut ads for all of them. And like this was before really social media. So like YouTube was just starting to become a thing. And then particularly for political campaigns, they weren't really using it in an organic way. It was basically a place to like host content that like was maybe slightly too long for air and your announcement video, but it wasn't like today where you just see tons and tons of pieces of content. But it was more that I cut so much stuff that never even made its way to the light of day. Like, you know how that goes, where when you're in the middle of it, it's like the strategy changes, the message changes, whatever. And so there were just so many ads that I cut that just never even made their way.
Yeah.
out.
Well, I just love the exercise, particularly the advice for young people that this is the time to get your reps in and cut 500 ads as a way to start to advance your career and your aesthetic and your understanding of it.
Well, and like learning how to tell a story in post-production is really hard. The pacing of it, what makes sense where. Like even the best editors are still learning new tricks, right? And I think actually that's the big thing that I always, I'm sure we'll get there, but I am, an executive creative director at an ad agency now. And one of the things I always try to tell the new people coming in is that none of it is busy work. Like none of it's busy work. And it may feel like busy work. It may feel like the things that somebody is asking you to do don't matter, but they're ultimately going to matter for your ability to do things well and quickly and the right way in the future. And it's really hard to hear that. Like I remember when I first started my career being like, man, people at the top have it so good. They're just chilling, right? Like they give me an assignment. I see you nodding. Yeah. They give me an assignment and they just like go do it, like drink their coffee. I don't know, maybe have a cocktail with a client, call it work, As somebody who did that last night and is hurting a little bit this morning, I promise you it is work. But like, particularly with AI and how generative AI models, I think, are where they are coming and where they are going to have the biggest impact, it's really going to be, I think, in the creative fields, entry-level work. And so I've been thinking a lot, is like, how do I get ahead of that, not just in terms of making my team efficient, which is where the pressure from an agency comes, but also in terms of setting a younger team up for success. Because like entry-level work is often thought of as being replaceable, but senior level work is not. But people don't get to be senior level unless they have the opportunity to experience the things and make those mistakes and learn how to do things by failing at an entry level. And so I've been thinking a lot about how do I like make my team learn some of this stuff, because yes, you can ultimately be a fantastic mid-journey prompt engineer, but you're still going to have to take it into Photoshop or Illustrator and make it what you want, particularly if you're working for a brand. And so how do you make sure that they still have the fundamentals and understand when you're making, people do resizes all day, that's part of it. And that's actually getting you to where you want to be as, an art director, an ACD, or a creative director someday. I think about that a lot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Having been in the weeds a little bit now with Midjourney and DALL-E and other text to image or text to video as well, and the pace of what clients want, the budgets that you have to work with, it's all sort of demanding that we use these tools.
Yep.
It's not so much a luxury even. It feels like, okay, we're all just kind of upping the overall like expectations, the curve, grading on the curve, so to speak.
Yeah.
And for folks to embrace these technologies, it will allow them to keep up. I actually really hated timed tests growing up, and always thought that it was like, well, I could get this right if I had enough time, but I've grown to really appreciate that training because it's always a timed test.
That's the thing, right? Like there's always a timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's always a timeline. And like, I will say, like they just get tighter. Get tighter. And this is frankly where I think my training in politics has been so beneficial, right? Because I used to think that working in political advertising, it would be, I would see these big agencies, like everybody looks at, the Drogas and, the Goodbees of the world as like these, well, at least I do, like these sort of mythical creatures, like doing this incredible, and it is, right? Incredibly creative, big thinking, big picture work for these brands. But the day-to-day grind, I think, of what's happening over there is actually very similar to like anywhere else, where it is about getting as many assets done on the tight timelines for budgets that feel ridiculous. And even if they don't, all the budgets don't look the same, it's the same kinds of pressures.
Absolutely. And I wanted to talk more about that sort of intersection of public affairs, politics, and advertising, which clearly you are really at the cross-section of. And if you could just explain that a little bit, because I think when most people think of advertising, it's very monolithic. And a company maybe has their agency of record, if people even know what that means, that just does their work. But in this day and age particularly, there is so many different niches within advertising. So can you tell us a little about what the function of your particular role is at that style of blending public affairs with advertising and how that is different from regular advertising, or maybe like, you know, the sort of cereal commercials, so to speak, or any other stereotype about advertising you think of?
So the intersection of sort of what I would call brand marketing, which is what I think most people think of as advertising when you turn on your TV and see an ad for chips or soda or jeans, right? With brand reputation advertising, which is like, we're a brand doing great things, you should like us because. And public affairs advertising, which is a shade, I think, of brand reputation, but geared specifically towards people who make decisions about how that brand is discussed in the media and how legislation might be passed that could impact that brand. And so sort of not just this brand is doing good things and you should feel good about it for a general population, but this brand is doing good things and you should feel good about it for media, people in politics. We always say people who go to a cocktail party and talk about what's on the front page of the New York Times. So if you're somebody who is aware of the news and cares about the news, and we often use voting as a proxy, right? Who's engaged in public affairs in a real way. That's sort of where public advertising comes in, because it's really important, I think, for brands not just to sell products, right? Selling products is baseline sort of table stakes. We don't do that kind of advertising at BPI. We always say we don't sell soap. It's harder to sell ideas, I think, than soap. And so what we try to do is tell the stories of the things that brands are doing to do right by their employees, to do right by the world, or to do right by their communities. And that often takes the shape of different kinds of stories around benefits, or even like it can sometimes look like product marketing, but it would be product marketing. So it would be your cereal ad, but with a twist about how like maybe this cereal is like, you know, if it was General Mills, right, made using regenerative farming. And so like there would be an underlying message, not just that you should buy this cereal because it will get your kids to school full and, you know, ready for the day, but because it also has a good impact in the world, with the thought being that ultimately if there ends up being a conversation around companies who are doing the right thing in agriculture, perhaps they are one of the brands that comes to mind as a company doing the right thing.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. That is such an important distinction to have. And to your point about engaging or reaching people who are informed, who are, you know, really tuned in to what brands do and what's happening in the country, that's the type of messaging that is much more meaningful to that audience.
Well, and frankly, it's a pretty natural extension of political advertising. There are a lot of foundational elements that I think are really similar between the two. In political advertising, you're so reliant on message testing and understanding, you know, individual constituencies and how they're reacting to individual, you know, specific issues, what they really care about, and how to package those up in a way that a candidate or a campaign can deliver that really resonates with, you know, those individual groups that are necessary to win. I think public affairs advertising is really not that different. There is a lot of message research that is critical, and a lot of not just message research, but the extension of it, like what we call narrative research. Like, how does the story unfold, and what are the pieces of the story that really resonate with these sort of key audiences, but also is there a cadence or a waterfall in which they sort of need to be communicated to be effective? So, you know, you can't start where you want to end up to be successful, right? There's got to be breadcrumbs of a narrative that takes people on the journey, because a lot of companies that have reputational challenges, it's interesting. Many of them, and I'm going to sound like a shill, and you can roll your eyes at me, but many of them actually are doing good things. They're doing, you know, not great things also, but they are doing good things. And many of them haven't figured out how to tell that story, and in fact have made missteps in trying to tell that story that haven't been well received, or maybe have even caused backlash. And that's where people like me come in.
What I think is so impactful about it is all of the collective work being done by all these different companies, whether they're working with BPI or anyone else. But the fact that they are doing this, they're looking at what their competition is doing, and all of them together are kind of like pushing them forward. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if BMW sees that Mercedes did some interesting environmental work, those executives, those engaged people, right, that type of audience we were just talking about, is the one who's seeing it and seeing how the public responds, and then seeing how, say, their team has to go, look, we need to do better, guys. Look what this competition is doing. And so all of that back and forth is this really great, like, healthy competition that seems to be like driving us in the right direction.
Well, and this is frankly where the liberal in me sleeps well at night, because I always say that, you know, on whatever schedule of the place that you live in, you can cast a vote for your elected officials. But every single day when you spend money, you get to vote on how you want corporations, businesses to show up in the world. Because with every dollar, you are saying, I support your business practices. Every single dollar. And so, and I know this really resonates with you because, you know, I actually have a side story I want to tell you that I was telling my husband the other day about when you and I first started working together, and why I now carry a water bottle everywhere I go, because you were like one of the first environmentalists in my life that showed me to do that. But like, I think a lot about how I shop and how my dollar shows up in the world with corporations and the kinds of decisions that they make. For example, today, one of my biggest clients is Walmart. I do a lot of work with Walmart. But you look at the landscape today, and Walmart's biggest competitor, well, they have many competitors, but, you know, is a company that does mostly shipping-based commerce. And when you look at who is creating jobs in particularly suburban and rural communities, and are those jobs that can support an individual or a family, and do they have benefits and a path to upskilling or education? Like, Walmart is putting more people through college right now than I think even the government is. It's like things like that they have been pushed to do because it has become required for what it means to be a good company. And it's been really exciting to be a part of that with them in a very small way, where we get to tell the story of, you know, people have opinions about what it means to work at a Walmart store. And you go in and you talk to these associates, and they love Walmart. Like, they love working for Walmart because the benefits that they have and the pay that they get, it's not something that people expect. And so when I talk about working for companies that actually have a good story to tell, but maybe are still figuring out how to tell it, Walmart is one of the ones I really like to talk about, because it has been actually an unexpected joy of my career to get to work with them and tell some of those stories and meet associates all across the country, because I always feel like if I am surprised by the stories these companies have to tell, a lot of people in their key audience are going to be too. And so I often am not telling stories for myself, but I think about the people that I know and how would they be surprised, and what can I do to surprise them, but also then have them believe it because it's true. And so that's where the challenge is, but I think also the excitement and the opportunity.
Yes, we need to make sure that companies are behaving good, and sometimes it's just a little nudge to know that this is going to be a public story and not just something they do to sleep well at night themselves that gets them on board, right? Mm-hmm. And not that it's all performative, but I think the act of storytelling, you know, that narrative you talked about, is so vital to the company's identity. This is something we do privately, we talk about it publicly, and it becomes that kind of, like you said, a way for liberals to sleep well at night, that we're all trying to do better, right? And it's just one step at a time.
Totally. And I also think, though, that, like, the more we're aware of how the media is covering brands, the better we're able to do it, too. Like, really paying attention about the kinds of stories, the kinds of language they're using, how different brands are positioned. That often gives you an indication of, do they have a strong public affairs and or brand reputation campaign or not? Because if you see them parroting numbers in particular, what we call proof points, like this company has given, healthcare on day one or whatever, it is likely that that company has a pretty strong public affairs campaign running. But if they're sort of like, we can't think of anything this company does for their employees, they are likely in need of BPI and our services.
Well, speaking of BPI, wonderful company. You've been there a while. I would love to hear from you what the early days were like, and then bring us up to the present. I love that, by the way, you were able to keep BPI, but now it's Interactive is now international, which is really exciting. So maybe if you can tell us that story and talk about this exciting merger or acquisition.
Yeah, so after the Brown campaign, I actually went to Pop Sugar, which is a sort of digital lifestyle blog. And I was one of the really early members of their video team. And we were doing sort of daily pop culture news content. And it was really in the very early days of organic YouTube and how do you get people to actually engage with content. And so it was a really interesting education for me in terms of how organic video in particular, at the very early stages of it, could be something that people wanted to engage with. But I really missed politics. So I ended up moving back to DC. And I worked under Tad Devine and Julian Mulvey for a cycle, cutting a bunch of their ads in 2012. And then I just actually freelanced for a long time. I was out on my own, just working for different companies in DC. I was lucky enough to work for, I think, just about every major political group in DC. And through that was introduced to AKPD, which at the time was an early investor in Bully Pulpit Interactive. They were considered a sister company. AKPD, if you don't know, is one of the sort of OG great political advertising companies. David Axelrod, Mike Donnellan were the partners there. When I went, Isaac Baker, and I think Isaac is still there, they're fantastic ad makers, really, really smart political strategists. And they shared an office with BPI. And so I was introduced to Andrew Bleeker, who's the CEO of BPI, through Isaac Baker at AKPD. Went in, and I still tease Andrew about this to this day, went in and had an interview thinking I was interviewing at AKPD. And it turns out I was hired by BPI. And I am grateful every day that that was a bait and switch Andrew pulled on me, because I signed a 6-month contract. I was only supposed to be there for 6 months. And this July will be 10 years. So Andrew is getting the last laugh. But I went in to do one campaign. We had a campaign with the D Trip that year that they needed somebody to run the video side of. And so it was yet another sort of trial by fire learning experience where not only was I editing the ads, but I was also learning on the fly how to write and produce them. And this is why I give a lot of credit to, frankly, going into the office, because I was so lucky that Mike Donnellan and Isaac Baker at AKPD were generous with their time and willing to mentor me, because when they saw that we had this opportunity, I would take my scripts to them, they would workshop them with me, and they were so kind to me when I had no idea what I was doing. And they probably don't even remember me, for what it is worth, but I owe a lot of my career and where I am now to the fact that they took 15 minutes out of their day twice a week to sit down and be like, this script sucks. And they were never mean, but they were very like, you got to do it differently, and I learned so much in such a short amount of time because we were lucky enough to share an office, like totally just by coincidence, and because they were really generous and kind with their time. And so, we had a pretty successful cycle that year, and I ended up staying on. And when I joined the team, there were a few designers, but we didn't really have what I would consider a creative team. And so over the past 10 years, it has been really an effort in growing the team from what I would consider sort of a political ad shop, like a team that can sort of churn out political style ads, to an actual creative advertising agency. And now we're working for some of the biggest companies in the world, Walmart, Disney, almost some of the big tech companies. And doing really high level, high stakes campaigns for them that are not just about the ads, but are about the creative strategy and how does it come to life? What is the platform? And how can we employ it over the course of multiple years? And the fact that I have been able to go from being a video editor to an executive creative director, I think has been a lot of work, but also because I've been in the right place at the right time and was able to take advantage of those lanes and opportunities when they opened up.
Beautiful story. I love the phrase creative leadership. And now with the company being so much larger, you obviously have to work with a broad team. Some people maybe are less creative, they're leading accounts. Some people are very creative, they understand your language. How do you communicate across these departments, whether it's on a pitch or the execution? How do you oversee everything that goes out the door and put your stamp of approval? How do you operate as a executive creative director?
You know, if there's anything that I could tell anyone, it's like everyone's still fucking figuring it out, right? Like everybody's doing the best they can. How do I do it? I think the interesting thing about BPI is that we really are a truly integrated team. And so we have leadership across the agency who come from research backgrounds, communications backgrounds, crisis backgrounds, speech writing backgrounds, and many others. And so it is an exercise every day in learning how to communicate effectively and frankly, empathetically with all of them, because there's a lot of education that feels like it needs to happen over and over and over and over. And not in a bad way, but it's just like everybody I work with are best in class at their thing, right? Like Robert Gibbs is a partner at BPI, and he's the, former White House press secretary, right? And, he's the best in class at what he does. And learning how to work with so many people who come out of the highest levels of politics has been interesting, because their expertise wasn't always necessarily on just advertising. It's in message communication, and they're all different ways of communicating a message. Advertising happens to be one. And so I've really tried to get better at the very beginning of a project, making clear that all the major stakeholders understand what are the milestones of any given project, right? Like, how do we get from this is our challenge to not just here is our solution, but here is our deliverable, like even going a layer deeper and laying out very, very, very clearly at the beginning of a project, not only what are the milestones, but who owns them. And if I have examples of what those milestones look like, including them. Because that way, if people have questions, we're answering them hopefully at the beginning of a project instead of panicking in the middle about what are we doing. And ask me how I know. Yes, this was a hard-learned answer. I also try really hard to make sure that not only do I have good relationships across the agency with other members of leadership, that members of my team are working hard to create those relationships with other members of other teams. Because I really do believe that the better relationships we have internally, people don't have to be best friends. No one has to go on vacation together. I don't even care if you drink together, right? But I do want everybody to respect each other and treat each other, with kindness, frankly. I have a very strong no jerks policy on my team. And so the stronger those relationships are, it pays dividends in, number one, being able to pitch the crazy idea to the client. Like when you have the trust of your account team, they may not agree that it's necessarily the right thing for that client, but they'll give you the leash to pitch fun things, right? When you have that trust, when you have that respect. But then they'll also go to bat for you to get more work, because it's so much easier to upsell a current client than it is to go out and win a new client. And so when you've got a team that trusts the work that you do, right, they want to work with you to find ways to go get more work with you, right? And because it makes everybody look better. And so when you can create those opportunities with your internal teams as well as your clients, you're just going to be so much better off.
Couldn't agree more. No, I think, it's a lot, right? And I sometimes find myself obviously with a much smaller team, still feeling like I'm doing a lot of mental gymnastics, going from one account and their particular set of creative challenges to a completely different one, from, stacked meetings.
Yeah, makes your brain hurt. I work on probably 20 clients a week.
20.
And like not all at the same level. Like some of them I'm just sort of like, my team has a challenge and is banging their head against a wall and they ask me to be like, I'm just a sounding board. And some of them I'm really deep. And some of them I have a really close relationship with the client. But it's like over the course of the week, yeah, probably 15 to 20. And it's fucking hard. I don't know what to tell you. My brain hurts all the time. Am I allowed to swear on this? I probably
Yeah,
no,
first, of course. We're not monetized.
I swear quite a lot.
No, it's totally fine.
It's actually
you
pretty
can
tame.
please be yourself. Yeah, no, I certainly can empathize with that, and obviously I'm always trying to do the same to sort out, the different challenges and solutions for each particular relationship and what each client needs at any given time. So you mentioned these terrific subject matter experts. You also mentioned a lot of very fundamental leadership principles. And so those two elements are what seems to be your kind of tools, right? Of like a great set of subject matter experts, and then the intuition or the skills of a leadership, a good leader to make sure there's no jerks, to make sure people are performing well and that you're holding high expectations, but delivering candid feedback with kindness and all of those sorts of things.
I wouldn't say kindness all the time. I do strive for it, but yeah, I would say fair. I try to be kind, but yeah, I think fair.
No, I think everyone appreciates that.
Yeah.
And across all of that is respect.
Right.
For what the client is feeling or what your internal team is feeling and all that pressure. Maybe if you could just talk a little bit more about, a typical campaign from that, okay, we're bringing in a new business or we're brand new campaign for an existing business. What does that early stage look like? And then how do you see that through execution, delivery? What's the life cycle of a project for you?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I think that I stay at BPI and have been there for, again, a decade, is that we're lucky enough to be an agency that is growing so fast that every project in many ways feels different because it's either playing at a higher level, more sophisticated, the challenge is harder or bigger or on a bigger stage, right? And so at the beginning of every project, the first thing I try to do with the other leadership groups, and there's usually many leaders on a project. There's always one person who owns it, but there are usually many leaders, meaning if it is a project that involves research and communications and advertising and media, all of those stakeholders sort of come together, and I'm the creative rep. And we basically try to figure out what is it? What are we solving for? And sometimes that means we start with research. Sometimes that means we start with a different kind of strategy. Sometimes it's comms forward, which means that creative supports in a different kind of way. It's not always an advertising solution, right? And I think the unique thing about BPI is we are never trying to sell one service. We are trying to help you get to an outcome. And so defining not only what that outcome is, but the strategy that is going to get us there and the services that are imperative to achieving that strategy is always where we start. And so once we've determined that creative will be a part of that solution, it's oftentimes figuring out what kinds of creative are important. So for example, we're working on a project for an entertainment client right now where they want to find better ways to talk to their employees. And by proxy, policymakers. So, showing employees we're doing XYZ, we value these things. And so also then, making it public enough that policymakers see that because we value this in employees, we must be this kind of company, right? And so at the very beginning of the project, they said, we don't want this to be an advertising-based program. We want it to be more organic. We want it to feel grassrootsy. And at the same time, we want it to show up in the places our employees show up. And so the great thing about that was we weren't just pitching video spots, although I do love making, TV commercials. We were pitching activations. Like, what are the kinds of things these employees might interact with on their day-to-day? And when you think of their day-to-day, some of that's physical, some of that are the places they go. How can this campaign show up in a way that's tangible? But it's also like, how are they using the internet and their devices throughout the course of the day in a way that we can touch them in more of an organic way? So are there ways we can activate their own colleagues? And so they would see the things that they're posting and be like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that option was available for me, or look at these people taking advantage of this benefit. That's kind of cool. And then all of the places that they're going on the internet as well, but in trying to do it in more organic ways. And so that's been a really fun challenge. But again, at the very beginning, we had to define what are we doing and what are the pieces. And so from there, the team sort of takes that brief, which, making a great brief is a process in and of itself. Takes the brief, and I'm lucky enough that my team is about 30 people now, and we assign the right group of people to each project and sort of let them go to town. And my role has really gone from being the ideas guy, which I miss, frankly, to making sure that the work is done in a way that actually answers the strategy laid out at the beginning. I'm the guy that now pokes the holes at the ideas and pressure tests them against what we're trying to achieve. And I'm only able to do that because we've got such a fantastic team of creatives who are now the ideas guys, right? And I think that is the flip side of leadership, is if you're really good at something, you end up getting farther and farther away from it as you progress in your career. And so we go from the ideas, poking at them, I poke at them, we include the other stakeholders to make sure that they think they answer the strategy, and then we present to the client. And if all goes well, the client buys it. And if they don't, we go back to the drawing board. And hopefully we don't get it wrong more than once, because then you're going to lose the business. And then from there, we do what it takes to launch the campaign. So whether that is creating assets, whether that is packaging up the strategy and handing it off, whether that's actually going out and capturing a bunch of things for them, or even bringing events and activations to life, it just depends on what they want to buy. And frankly, I always think that as a creative lead, like, the job is to give them not only what they want and what they are asking for, but to take it one step further and say, like, okay, this is where you're at now, but if this goes well, this is where you could be at in a year. And so here's one or two things just to be thinking about, because we think they're going to need a longer lead time. But as you look ahead to how is this campaign performing, here's where you could take it. And we do that really not only because it's good for the client, but because it's good for our business. And if they buy that, right, then we've got a longer term relationship than a one-off engagement.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the sort of success of the projects being so vital. And I think in age of a very crowded internet with a lot of influencers and brands and you name it competing for attention, what is working for your teams? How are you breaking through? How are you setting client expectations? How are you thinking about organic versus earned and versus IRL experiences as sort of the metrics for success?
It's an interesting question. I have kind of a controversial answer. I think that all that shit doesn't matter. Like, I just think that, like, it used to be, like, remember, like, there was a period where it's, like, it's about going viral? Like, that never mattered. Like, it was, like, I mean, if you want to get a bunch of headlines, sure, that's cool, but, like, it doesn't actually matter. And, like, I think that, there was a time where I would say, like, influencers and content creators really did matter. And now I think we're all at a point where it's, like, you can tell immediately if you are being influenced. Right? Like, you get on Instagram and when somebody is like, oh my God, this makeup changed my life. And you're like, fuck you. No, it didn't. And so I do think we're in a different age of sort of how do you do it in a way that people are more skeptical. Like, we talk about misinformation all the time like it is a problem in politics. And it is. It really is. But it's a problem across the board, right? Like, it isn't just a political problem. People haven't trusted brands for a really long time. And everything we're finding about particularly the food like food companies about what they're putting in there and what that does to our bodies. Like, I think we all suspected it for a long time, and now it's being confirmed. So it's like we don't trust those brands. As we become more environmentally and climate aware, we don't trust like the companies that are making clothing, because no one's doing that well or ethically, right? We don't trust anybody who's selling us anything, because we know they're lying to us and they're just getting a check. And so like I don't think it's about the mediums. Like I think it is about the way that you are actually communicating, and how do you actually strike a chord in a way that allows people to believe it. And so I do think it is a confluence of things. Like I don't think there is any one silver bullet. And this isn't, again, not a new thing. It's like, you know, you went to SMPA, you know, there was a time in political advertising where if you ran the right ad on the nightly news next to Walter Cronkite, you were going to win, right? That's how we got Kennedy. And so like, but that world is so far past, and we are in not only a fractured media environment, but a fractured trust environment. And so the more likely that's like the best way to actually get someone to believe something you're saying is for your friend to tell you something. Right? And so like the question is, how do we influence your friends? And then you're back at square one, right? Where it's the same kind of challenge. And so it's really gotta be, I think, a mix of different kinds of advertising and content and headlines, but also things that people can interact with where they can feel like they did their own research. Like, how do you breadcrumb them to feeling like, I discovered this, I wasn't fed this? Because that's where I think the actual persuasion or belief comes in.
I love the analogy of the breadcrumbs, because it's really what it feels like when you get that little, you know, IG story and then you see a bus go by, or then you just kind of live in this world, right, where you're starting to get clues, and then maybe you hear it from a friend, or maybe you read that New York Times article, or whatever it is. And then that, I think, goes back to what you were saying earlier about this idea of like narrative.
Yep.
And yeah, go ahead.
And like, I think best case scenario is like somebody sees something and they're like, I don't believe that. And they Google it. And like the top response is like a publication that they actually trust, which, I mean, that's a whole other conversation, that says like backs up what you're saying. And their search results are like, you know, also then, you know, a subreddit talking about a personal experience that it backs up that same idea. And you know what I mean? It's like, how many different kinds of things can you make part of the campaign to make something real? Because all of it matters.
Yeah, and I love the idea of it just being finally that friend who talks to you about it,
yeah,
and who you actually listen to. So it's more about like reverse engineering your target audience's friends' interests, and maybe the ad that they hear on the podcast they listen to, or whatever it is,
yeah,
ends up being how you kind of make that circle of
totally
communications reach its right audience. But it's definitely not a straight line. That breadcrumbs is like, you know, all over the table.
And it's so interesting because like you didn't even bring up celebrities and celebrity endorsements, because that used to be like the thing people thought mattered. And like, I don't even think we think about that as a thing by and large that you need to have, or maybe even want to have, in many of these categories anymore. Maybe with the exception of Taylor Swift.
You're right. No, I think she touches everyone.
Yeah.
So last topic I want to touch on, we're coming up on an election year, an election cycle.
Yeah.
I know we talked a lot about the brand side, but BPI also dabbles in politics, I might be able to say. What are you seeing this cycle? What are you hearing from the various departments within BPI? What are you seeing candidates doing, or PACs? How is the ecosystem unfolding? How are you guys a part of it? How are you contributing? What's your role in this 2024 cycle?
I can't really talk about what BPI is doing. They've
Sure.
asked me not really to talk about like our clients. I will say we are involved and very active, but I can't really talk
Sure.
about our clients. I don't know if you've noticed, I do wear a vote necklace every day, because I think this election is going to be really difficult for everybody, because it's a rematch. And I think the challenge with federal politics, particularly at the presidential level, is that it takes so long for these policies to actually make an impact in individual lives that by the time they go into effect, you may not even realize that there was a policy that was, you know, pushed by a certain president or Congress, because the thread to that happening and it showing up in your life is so tenuous and is definitely not straight, right? And so they're actually, you know, it probably is not a surprise, huge stand for the, you know, liberal side of the Democratic Party. But I think even the most impactful policies, like the IRA, it's like touching that is hard. Like, how does that actually show up in my life? Like, unless you are somebody who installs solar panels for a life, like for a job, like, has that actually made a difference? And I think that getting people motivated to vote this year is going to be the biggest challenge. Like, by and large, the only thing we should all care about is getting people to vote. Because when Democrats show up to vote, Democrats win. And there are so many fucking more of us than there are of them. So show up and vote. And so, like, the biggest thing I have been telling everybody is, like, yeah, hold your fucking nose in doing it, because the alternative is so much worse. Like, just so much worse. Like, it's democracy or not. And those are, like, not the same thing. And so, like, I am very much on my high horse about this. Like, how is it all going to play out? There's going to be, like, so much more money than you've ever seen, but it is all going to be spent in an effort to actually make people care about it, because people are so fucking worn out about it. And they just feel like, I've seen this before. I know how it plays out. People forget how it felt when Trump was in office, when every single day you woke up to another insane thing, another insane comment, another ally or promise broken, another assault on things that we thought were untouchable about our democracy, which, surprise, they are not. Abortion shows us that, right? Roe shows us that all of these things we thought were truths about American democracy are only true if we keep showing up to keep them, right? And so I know I'm, like, on a bit of a rant right now, but I think everybody has a responsibility to make their friends vote. Everybody does, especially your friends in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Virginia. Yeah, like, make them go vote.
So what do you think will make them vote? Do you think it's these...
Peer pressure. Seriously, it's the only thing. Peer pressure. And shame, but, you know. What do I think? You know, we could talk about issues. I mean, like, if abortion and, you know, student loan debt and, you know, home buyer credits and all of that don't motivate people, climate, right? One side wants to fix those things, one side does not. Like, if those are the things that don't motivate you, like, the things that motivate you are things that I think are more about identity politics than Republicans would like us to believe, just in a different kind of way, right? And so I always ask people to think about what kind of world do they want to live in, at the risk of sounding Pollyanna-ish, because, like, I think it's a pretty clear difference.
Well, I was just thinking more on the tactical level. You were mentioning that it's these friends, right? And I think maybe in a more agency language, you would call them micro-influencers, or even just your circle of friends, right? So is it really about getting the 1 in 10 kind of group that are galvanized enough to have those chats or dinner conversations?
I think that's a big part of it. Although I will say that, like, we all have the, I'm sure, trope of the, you know, uncle at Thanksgiving that you don't really want to engage with, right?
Well, he's shooting his shot.
Yeah, well, my family, they're shooting more than a shot. Central Pennsylvania, you know, like, we grew up with guns. So I'm just like, I think that talking about it is really, really important. I think, yes, micro-influencers are really important. But I do think all of us making an effort to read and share real news is also a part of it. Like, not sharing the stuff that is the clickbaity, like, we all actually are really guilty of this, right? Where it's like something comes across your feed and you're so outraged you feel like you need to repost it. You don't need to repost that, right? But you know exactly what I mean. Like, there's so much going on in the world right now that is outrageous, that is infuriating. And you see this packaged thing comes across and you're like, that perfectly encapsulates how I feel about this thing. And you repost it only to find that it wasn't true. Like, we're all guilty of it. And it's like, don't do that. Like, go find the stuff that actually is true and share that stuff, because that stuff does matter.
I like that. That's going to be a good slogan of, like, think before you repost.
And I've put myself on a reposting moratorium. Like, I don't repost anymore. I'm like, if I care enough about this, I need to make my own post about it. And you'd be surprised at how quickly that stops you from posting dumb shit on the internet. Yeah.
Great.
Does that answer your question? I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, I mean, I think it's a whole confluence of things that needs to happen to
I'm talking about the more
engage people to
grassrootsy
vote.
stuff, like talking about, like, I can talk about paid and advertising if you want, but like, I think that it, just like we were talking about with brands, I think news and interpersonal relations are going to be a big part of it. I think advertising has a huge role to play in politics. But I think, again, given the fractured media environment, I think it's going to look very different. It's so fascinating because, you know, TV advertising still has such a chokehold on political advertising. I think figuring out how to be really efficient with the dollars that you do get in ways that feel very individualistic even when they're not, because people want to feel like you're talking to them. So even in your individual advertising, it's like, how can you make it feel like something you, rider, care about, not just guys who look like you who happen to live in Maryland and also, you know, are into advertising and animal rights.
That sums up my character pretty well. We got the file in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. I pulled it.
Well, this has been really great. We're at 10 o'clock, so I think we can wrap it up here. Okay. But thank you so much, Christina. It's been wonderful to have a chance to collaborate over the years and to watch your career evolve. Thank you so much for joining us. Anything else you want to end on or talk about?
Go vote.
Go vote.
Go vote.
All right, that's the message for the day.
Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.